Well, hello everybody and welcome to a very special episode of Inside Asian Gaming's Trade Talk. For many years, Crown Casino was the undisputed leading casino in Australia. Opened at a temporary facility in 1994 on the north bank of the Yarra River in the heart of Melbourne, it then moved in 97 to its current permanent location on the river's south bank. Crown's enjoyed a monopoly on legal casino gaming in the state of Victoria ever since such activities were legalised in the state. And back in 2014, that monopoly was extended to the year 2050. Crown's been the subject of numerous media stories in recent years about a wide range of controversial issues, money laundering, problem gambling, dealing with junkets, even their misadventures in mainland China, which led to staff being arrested, convicted and jailed. The New South Wales Bergin inquiry found Crown unsuitable to open a casino in New South Wales, despite now having built Crown Sydney at a cost of around US $1.7 billion. Now Crown finds itself in two royal commissions, one in Victoria under Commissioner Finkelstein and one in WA. So to discuss this further, I'd like to introduce our very special guest, Peter Cohen, the former Executive Commissioner and Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Gambling Regulator. And I think it's safe to say, Peter, very well respected in that position from 2002 to 2010 when he held that position, and then leaving the VCGR just a few years before everything seemed to go so wrong with Crown Casino and its regulation from the early 2010s. Peter, welcome to IAG Trade Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andrew.
Peter, perhaps before we get into the details of what's going on with Crown at the moment, you'd like to just explain your role with the regulator when you joined, the various incarnations of the Victorian Casino regulator, and the positions that you had over those years.
Well, I joined the Victorian Gambling Regulator in 1996, and between that period when I joined and 2002, I looked after the three line areas of responsibility. That's compliance, licensing, and gambling operations. And the gambling operations area is the group that approves the rules of games, but also audits and verifies tax revenue and ensures that the practices incorporated in gaming are working properly. From 2002 to 2004, I held the title of CEO of the organisation and also the statutory roles of Director of Casino Surveillance and Director of Gaming and Betting. And then after a structural change from 2004 to 2010, I was both CEO and Executive Commissioner of what was then called the Victorian Commission for Gambling Regulation.
So, Peter, obviously Crown's been embroiled in a lot of trouble in recent weeks and months and even a couple of years. And we had just the other day, Adrian Finanzio, our counsel assisting the Finkelstein Royal Commission, deliver quite an excoriating sort of closing remarks and recommendations to the Commission. Where do you think we sit now with what's going to happen to Crown? I mean, in terms of the really genuine possibility that might lose its license or be suspended or something else. How would you rank those options in terms of probabilities?
It's very much an exercise in educated guessing, I think, at this stage. What we do know is that Royal Commissions historically tend to support what counsel assisting tells the Commissioner in closing submissions. And what Adrian Finanzio has done here is given the Commissioner, Ray Finkelstein, two options, in effect. He said that it's open to you to find that Crown is unsuitable to be licensed, and it's also open to you to find that Crown continues to be unsuitable, but there is a potential future where you might find them, or a regulator might find them suitable, but there's some changes that are going to be necessary. What's relevant here is that the Royal Commission makes recommendations, it doesn't make decisions. It will make recommendations which will be presented to the government, and the government will hand that report to the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation, who are the only body actually able to make a final decision. So if the Royal Commission of Commissioner Finkelstein says that Crown is unsuitable to be licensed, it's very persuasive, but it's not the actual final decision, whichever way that he might choose to go.
So we've been hearing the media in Victoria and Australia saying, asking Premier Daniel Andrews what will he do, and asking for him for assurances. But what you're saying is it's actually not up to him at all. It's up to Ross Kennedy, the regular chairman of the regulator.
It's absolutely up to the regulator. The legislation is very clear that the only organisation that can cancel the licence is the Commission, the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation. The government can have an opinion, and the government can explain what it considers to be the outcome it would like to see. But as I've said many, many times when I was a regulator and subsequently, the regulator has to stand independently from government and make its decisions independent of the government. The government might have an opinion, but it can't be seen to be telling the Commission what to do. Otherwise, we lack confidence in the role of the regulator and its independent actions. There's been a lot of criticism over many, many years that the regulator is told by the government what to do. And I can assure you that when I was the CEO and executive commissioner, no one from government ever advised me of a particular outcome they wanted, whether it was to grant a license, refuse a license, or somehow find a way to increase tax revenue. And that shouldn't change today. So whilst the Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, who himself is a former gaming minister, might be tempted to make statements that people might think will influence the Commission should be immune to that sort of pressure.
So just being very, very clear there, it's totally up to the regulator to make that decision. And the chairman of the regulator at the moment is Ross Kennedy. So is it ultimately his decision? It's not Ray Finkelstein, it's not Daniel Andrews. The individual who's going to be making that decision is Ross Kennedy. Is that right?
Not quite. It's actually a commission as a whole. So Ross is the chairman, and there are other commissioners as well. But that organisation of which he chairs has to make the decision. So he becomes accountable for what his commission determines, but it's not a one-person decision. It's the commission as a whole. And I think there are 4 other commissioners who will also have to be involved in this decision-making process. The process to follow is quite clear. It's in the legislation, and if it's not followed, there are all sorts of possibilities that might occur, including Crown taking the process to the Supreme Court to stop it from occurring because it doesn't follow the correct process as outlined in the legislation.
I mean, I just think for the benefit of our viewers, many of who will understand, but some may not. I mean, this is the first time, certainly in my memory, that a multi-billion-dollar integrated resort is at serious chance, employing tens of thousands, or I think it employs about 9,000 people, doesn't it? Is at serious risk of losing its license. So we're talking billions and billions of dollars here. I mean, Crown, I think, is valued somewhere around maybe 7 or 8 billion Australian dollars, 5 or 6 billion US. I mean, that would pretty much wipe out most of that wealth, wouldn't it? We're talking an incredible financial decision in the hands of these regulators.
That's correct. So let's talk about what that decision actually is. The decision that could be made would be to cancel the casino license. Now, in the language of legislation, the casino license refers to that bit of the whole casino complex which involves the gaming. So the only thing that Crown would be prevented from doing is offering the gaming. They're not prevented from all the other activities they can undertake at that complex, which includes 3 hotels, retail precinct, nightclubs, conference facility, banquet facilities, much, much more than just a casino. Now, we all know, of course, that the casino is the main driver of that business, but it doesn't prevent the rest of the business from being operated. That's the first thing that's important to say. The second thing that's important to say is that if the license is cancelled, it doesn't mean gaming at the casino has to stop. There is a provision in the Act for the Commission to appoint a manager, and the manager can take over the running of the casino. And we've never been in this territory before, but I can't see why it couldn't be a seamless transfer from Crown operating it one day to a manager being appointed and continuing to operate it the next. From Crown's point of view, that means there might still be a casino operating there of which they don't get the revenue, but at least they still have the business coming to the complex to use their other facilities, such as the food and beverage that's outside the casino. They've got lots of terrific restaurants there. It brings people to the complex for other reasons. So it needs to be understood that a loss of license, as bad as that is not the nuclear option of closure of the whole facility, nor does it mean the casino itself might not continue to operate.
You mentioned a manager. I mean, that conjures up, I'm a former accountant, that conjures up images of somebody from KPMG or Deloitte or somebody like a liquidator coming in to administer a property under distress. Would it be, I mean, who would be the manager? Has there ever been an example of this ever happening before anywhere in the world? What sort of person would go in as a man? Would it be a company? Would it be an individual? What do you imagine that could be?
I don't know, because the manager is not defined in legislation to mean an individual or a company. So it could be either. So they could put you in as charge, or me, or they could put KPMG in charge. What I imagine could happen, the way I could see it working, is an individual coming in as the manager, retaining all of the Crown employees that they currently have, but letting a few go over time. And clearly from the discussions from counsel, not discussions, the advice of counsel assisting the Royal Commission, the CEO of the property, Xavier Walsh, would probably not continue to be there. There's probably a few others right at the top that might have to go. And when I say right at the top, perhaps that's not quite the right language to use. In specific positions where there are areas of concern, the leadership in those areas might have to stand aside, but the manager would probably retain, in volumes terms, 99% of Crown's casino employees. The non-casino employees are still the responsibility of Crown, but those that operate the gaming and all the functions associated with gaming, surveillance, security, responsible gaming liaison officers, they're all still going to be needed if a manager is going to continue to operate the property. So most of the Crown employees, I imagine, would continue to be there. And I then expect the manager, whether it's an individual or a company with that responsibility, would go about bringing cultural change to Crown to ready it for its next stage. And the next stage would be that the manager would hand over either back to Crown if it's a suspension of the license, or to a new licensee if it was a cancellation of the license and a process is followed to identify a new casino operator. And I should add, if they go down that path, Crown could be an applicant for that license, for the new version of the license.
I don't think there'd be a very popular applicant based upon everything that's happened recently. But anyway, we'll leave that for another day. So let's get this clear. So if the license was cancelled, or if the license was suspended for a period of time to then be handed back to Crown after that period of time, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it might be, the government could put a manager in place in the interim we don't know what that manager looks like, whether that's a single individual, a supremo, so to speak. We don't know if that's an accountant or a casino person or whatever, but then the money keeps flowing, right? Because the government gets a lot of tax from Crown Casino. I mean, I think in the recent Four Corners show, which we'll get to in a moment, earlier this month, Linda Hancock threw a figure of 13% around. I think that was the percentage for all gaming. I mean, how much revenue of the Victorian state government comes directly from Crown?
So the figure that Linda Hancock referred to as 13%, that's state-owned revenue. That excludes revenues from the Commonwealth. When you add in Commonwealth funding of the state of Victoria, the total from gambling drops from 13% to, I think, somewhere around about 5 or 6%. And of that, Crown is approximately about 20% of that revenue. It's significant, but it's not 13%. So that figure might have misled people. I don't mean deliberately, but people might not have understood that. Firstly, that's total from all forms of gambling, and it's the state's own revenues, not including Commonwealth. The bulk of the state's revenues come from slot machines outside the casino. That's the number one form of gambling tax to the state. The casino is actually number 3, because lotteries is second, and then the casinos is the third. If a manager is appointed, the revenue flow is different. Instead of there being tax, there is all the gross gaming revenue proceeds go to the government into the consolidated fund of the treasurer, minus some money that is paid to Crown at a fair rate for the use of their facility. So the use of their tables and so on.
So let's try and understand that, because if this were to happen, and it's looking like a serious possibility, I guess then the manager becomes effectively the owner of the revenue stream, but it has to, as you mentioned, has to pay, let's call it rent, for the facilities, but also Crown gets to continue to run the hotel, to run the restaurants, to run everything that is in gaming. And as we all know in the industry, you can't run an integrated resort without those things. So what's to stop Crown going, okay, fine, we're not the holder of a privileged license anymore. You guys are. But guess what? If you want to rent out, if you want to use our hotels, it's $700 a night for every player that you've got or whatever. What's to stop Crown jacking up all the prices and kind of going to war with the state government?
I think that's something that hasn't been contemplated through the process, and I think that's something both Crown and the government would be thinking about right now. Let's be clear that this is such uncharted territory. I don't think anybody's quite worked out what happens in this process. The one thing I would say, though, is if the casino license is suspended, meaning there is a chance to give it back to Crown, I think they'll be cooperative. If the license is cancelled, that might change their attitude. And they may still be cooperative, but there's less interest in them in being cooperative because they've already lost that license. At least a suspension of the license might give incentive for Crown to be more cooperative. And for that reason alone, I could see that the Commission might think, well, that's actually not a bad idea, because a reformed Crown should be no different to the Crown back between 1997 and 2010, where there was some respect for the organisation. It didn't appear to have the problems. If we can get it back to that form, in other words, if the regulator can get Crown to improve its corporate level behaviour, then perhaps it be worthy of getting its licence back. Remember that during the time of suspension, the employees that work on the gaming side won't be working for Crown, they'll be working for the manager. So the cultural change can be done by the manager rather than by Crown. Crown will then be, if you like, if they're given the licence back after suspension, will be given back let's call it a reformed group of employees.
You mentioned there about a period of time, 97 to 2010. I mean, there's been some talk in the commentariat about three crowns, an early crown, a middle crown, and a later crown that was kind of bad and then good and then bad again. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are, let's sort of divide them up into the period 1993 from when they first got licensed to about 2001. From 2001 to 2000, and it appears about 2014, and from 2014 to now. So that first period of 1993 to 2001 was fundamentally when it was under the management of Hudson Conway as the original developer of the property. In late 1999, PBL, under the control of the Packer family, then bought out Hudson Conway and took over management and operation of Crown and therefore the casino. And then in 2014, we saw the issues arise. A variety of different issues started to arise, showing Crown having lost its way to some degree. What happened in 2001 was that under the new management of PBL, the then CEO of Crown Melbourne and his executive general manager of gaming, I'm not quite sure if I've got the title correct, but it doesn't matter. Basically, the two most important people at the Crown probably came to the regulator and said, we recognise that Crown till now has not been that popular with the people in Melbourne. Certainly we have plenty of people coming and gambling, but we're not viewed by the people of Melbourne as something that's desirable, and we want to change that. We think for our business to be sustainable in the longer term, we have to be accepted as part of the Melbourne community, so we're going to change some of our practices. And the most obvious thing they did, which was a visual representation of that change, was the establishment of the Responsible Gambling Service Centre, the first in the world, where you had a combination of resources built into a part of the property but off the casino floor to aid gamblers who might have problems, or their families, where they could go and get advice. The Responsible Gambling Service Centre administered the self-exclusion program, put people with gambling problems in touch with psychologists and counsellors, all of that sort of thing. It was a world first, and many regulators and casino operators went and had a look at how Crown was doing it. And that was just part of a cultural change within the organisation to become a respected organisation. So from that period through to about 2014, Crown did develop a reputation within Victoria and the City of Melbourne of being a place to visit. It had great restaurants, it had great facilities, and it showed a willingness to care for its patrons.
And Peter, just to interrupt you there, I want to get the name. You're talking about under Rowan Craigie here, right?
Yeah, he was one of the two, and the other was Ian Johnson, who was formerly an executive within the PBL's media unit, who became across to Crown Melbourne as the CEO, and Rowan Craigie was his, whatever the second title was. I don't think it was ever Chief Operating Officer, but whatever it was, he was the 2IC at the time. That functioned very, very well. Now, something happened between 2012 and 2014, which allowed Crown to appear to change its behaviours. One of those things that happened was the regulator changed. In 2012, the government of the day decided to consolidate gaming regulation with liquor regulation. So what was the Victorian Commission for Gaming Regulation, the organisation I was the CEO and a commissioner of, became the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation. And we know that where liquor and gaming are combined into a single regulator, 80% of the time of the regulator is taken up on liquor matters. And that's beyond the fact that any cultural change where you put organisations together loses its way a bit anyway, any organisation. So after that merger, a lot of the gaming skill was lost. We know that because a lot of the experienced senior people left the gaming regulator for whatever reason. So between 2012 and 2014, the skill base of the Victorian gaming regulator was significantly diminished. Now, it's possible that what happened during that time is Crown found that the experience they'd previously had, where they got pushback for anything they wanted to do, they felt that pushback wasn't there anymore. So what I'm saying is that prior to 2012, certainly in my time there, Crown wouldn't do anything without getting the pre-approval of the regulator. And whilst the community thinks Crown got approval for everything they asked for, that's just not true. What they did get is approval for anything they asked for that the Commission agreed with. But generally what happened is a lot of the stuff that Crown wanted, they test the waters, ask the regulator informally, and we'd say, it won't fly, no, or try again, or do something different. And only after we'd had those informal discussions did they then put in a formal application. So in a technical sense, if you went back and look at the record, it looks like they got everything approved because they only asked for things that were going to be approved. So they were used to pushback. I don't have a problem with any casino operator anywhere pushing the boundaries. Okay, that's their job. I have no problem with that. It's the regulator's job to push back against that. And I think that wasn't happening between 2012 and 2014. So by the time we got to 2014, I think Crown was getting used to not getting pushback and was just continually pushing the boundary and finding it could get away with it. There's some conjecture in there on my part, but it fits the timeline.
So you raise an interesting point, and it leads to the Four Corners show on the ABC in Australia earlier this month, where we had 5 inspectors from the regulator, the VCGLR, basically, just excoriating Crown into saying how Crown effectively captured the regulator. They became a toothless tiger. They felt that there was no support from above. They saw what they described as illegal activity on the gaming floor, and they reported it, and it never went anywhere. What's your comment on all of this sort of discussion about the regulator being a toothless tiger and being captured by Crown, and Crown running amok over the regulator, even to the point, there was one example that really struck home for me was when the regulator wrote to Crown and said, you will not have a relationship with these 2 particular players because they have been, involved in illegal betting in the US. I think one was convicted. I won't name them, but and Crown just wrote back and said, well, we think it's fine. What's your take on all that? It certainly seems, after watching that show, that the regulator wasn't doing its job.
I think it's half right what they were saying. I think they clearly they were right that the regulator was incapable of doing what was necessary. Crown would never have pushed back in the time I was there and ignored what the regulator said. They may have questioned it. They may have asked, could we do something in a different way? Can we rethink it? And we wouldn't rethink it if they gave us new reasons to rethink. But they would never blatantly say, no, we're going to keep doing what we're doing anyway. The reason why I think they might be half right, though, is I suspect the regulator wasn't captured by Crown. I suspect the regulator wasn't told by the government to go easy on Crown. I suspect it was more that the regulator, having lost its skill, wasn't aware of its incapability and wasn't aware of how it ought to operate. And so those inspectors can't see that. From where they sit, they can't see what's going on the top of the organisation. They can see that the decisions being made aren't the ones they like, but they wouldn't necessarily know why they're the decisions they make that are being made that way. And I suspect it's more to do with a lack of capability than any conspiracy to somehow protect Crown or give Crown what it wants.
If you were the government and you did want to control the regulator in that way for the favour of the casino, I mean, the way to do it, I guess, wouldn't be necessarily to order, but to cripple the organisation from within. Less funding, less resources and so forth. And there's always been accusations, and they were repeated again in the Four Corners show, of the Packers, effectively the owners of Crown Casino, Jamie Packer, being too close to Daniel Andrews. There was video in that show of Lloyd Williams cozying up to Daniel Andrews, and this was the implication. So, I mean, we're getting a little bit into conspiracy theory zone here, but, you know, could it be possible that the Packers were very close to the Premier? The Premier didn't want the regulator pushing back against Crown and wanted to let Crown do whatever it wanted to do. So it was merged with the liquor regulator and was given less resources and basically white-handed from within so that it wouldn't stand up to Crown.
I guess all I can say is in the whole period that I was working with the regulator, at no time did anybody from a government office, from a minister, the Premier, any staff from any of the ministerial side of politics, no one ever asked me to make a specific decision that would favour Crown, or for that matter, cripple Crown. It was always understood that the regulator was there to make independent decisions, and that was completely understood by government, and Crown seemed to do very well anyway. So I don't think there was any need for the government to have a say because Crown was doing well. They were being prevented from doing the things they shouldn't do. The regulator was not there to assist Crown, it was there to regulate Crown. But as long as Crown was doing its business appropriately, the regulator has no problem with Crown making money. That it understands that it's a commercial business, as long as it's doing it in a way that's consistent with the expectations of it being fair and delivered responsibly. So it was always, right from when the Packers got control through PBL in, I think it was late 1999, or maybe it was 2000, through to when I left in 2010, no one ever asked me to make a specific decision to assist Crown. I don't know why that would have changed. So I think it's unlikely that the government has in any way tried to cripple the regulator. It's unlikely for many reasons, but the logical one right now is it would embarrass the government now, wouldn't it, the way Crown is performing? So it just makes no sense to me that the government has in any way tried to cripple the regulator to benefit Crown.
So the VSC-GLR will be making ultimately this decision after the Finkelstein Royal Commission reports. Can the government and even the people of Victoria have confidence in the regulator right now?
I think that's an issue that the government has to think about. I think that if the government doesn't have confidence in the regulator, and I don't know if they do or they don't, but if they don't right now, I'm not sure whether the people can either. And it's unfortunate because I think they're good people. But I think what might have happened is that matters have got out of their control. And whether they are now the right people to make that decision or not, I'm not sure, which comes to another problem. You can't, the government can't just automatically sack the chairman just because I don't like him. There's actually a procedure in the Act, and the chairman can be removed, but it's under very, very special circumstances. And think of it as being the things you'd expect a chairman to be removed for, misbehaviour or illegal activity or something like that, not just because they make decisions you don't like or so on. What we did see, though, 10 years ago or so, was the government established what I'll call a second set of commissioners. And this was at the time of the licensing of the wagering license, which eventually went to Tabcorp in 2010, 2012. I can't remember the years of the decisions, but it was in the early 2010s. The government had to make decisions on awarding licenses for monitoring of slot machines and for wagering and lotteries. and went through a process and determined that perhaps a better model would be to establish a second set of independent commissioners separate from the day-to-day commissioners, so they could make a decision on those licenses without any accusation of any bias either for or against any applicant. The view was that the commission that I was involved with, that commission might somehow be biased against or for TATS, Tabcorp, or anybody else that might be issuing a license. Now, at the time, I disagreed with that because we make each decision on its merits, but the government was concerned of a perception that others might have that the commission might be the inappropriate body to make those recommendations. So that way forward then might be a way forward now. The government might create a new commission. They've got powers to do it. They can create as many deputy commissioners as deputy chairs as they like. And you could establish a deputy chair with some co-commissioners with the sole responsibility of determining whether or not disciplinary action should be taken against Crown, and if so, what that disciplinary action ought to be. In other words, should it be suspension, cancellation, or for that matter, a fine or nothing at all? But not prejudging anything. They've got to go into it with an open mind and look at the evidence and make the decision. Whether it's what I'll call the Ross Kennedy Commission or whether it's a new commission is an option that the government might want to think about.
Well, that's an interesting spanner in the works you've just thrown in there. You mentioned a fine. Of course, the biggest fine that they can give is $1 million Australian dollars, which is a drop in the bucket for Crown. So just coming back to those options that you said, let's circle back to where we started. We've got complete cancellation of the license. We've got a suspension of the license. Another option might be something like what they're doing in Sydney, right, under the Bergin Commission. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the process is outlined in legislation. I'll just go back a step. Whatever happens here has to follow the Casino Control Act process. So you have to first determine the commission, and let's just call it the commission, whether it's Ross Kennedy's commission or a newly established commission, let's just call it the commission. And I'm talking about the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation, not the Royal Commission. Let's not get confused with terms here. So the Gambling Commission has power.
Maybe we can just call it the regulator.
The regulator, okay. The regulator has power under the Act to determine whether there are grounds for disciplinary action. It has to make that assessment based on facts put before it, and the report that Ray Finkelstein's commission puts together will be the foundation of that decision. So the regulator has to consider whether there are grounds for disciplinary action. If they think there are grounds, and they have to make their own decision, they are not just automatically assuming Ray Finkelstein's position. They have to make their own decision whether they agree with the Royal Commission. It's hard to believe they would not, but they still have to form their own view. They then have to put that to Crown, and they have to give Crown a minimum of 14 days to respond, because procedural fairness is built into the legislation. And if Crown asks for an extension of time, they'll almost certainly be given it, because they've always been given that extension of time before. And this is such an important matter. Why wouldn't you do it this time? So Crown will get at least, I think, 28 days and possibly longer to reply. Once Crown has replied, the Commission then has to look at Crown's response and see what Crown's response might be. And I don't know what Crown might say, but you could imagine they will talk about how they are putting in place a reform program and what they've achieved so far and what they intend to do. Once they've got that, the Commission, the regulator, then has to make a decision. And they can do that in two ways. They can either do it on the papers, in other words, on the written submission that Crown has received, plus the Royal Commission's report and any other information they've got, or they can conduct their own hearing, which can be public or private. In the end, though, they have to make a decision. And that decision can be suspension, cancellation, or they can also amend the conditions of the license. And that could be appointment of what New South Wales is calling a monitor. It could be an appointment of an external person to oversee everything they do, or it could be requiring Crown to establish an independent compliance committee that reports to the chair and also reports to the Commission. I mean, these options are open to the Commission to decide. I very much doubt it will be a letter of censure, and I don't think it'll be a fine. But in theory, that's what the legislation allows for.
You've said that Royal Commissions very commonly go with the submissions to them by the counsel assisting, and you've said that the regulator would be hard-pressed not to accept the decision of the Royal Commission. And we've seen what Counsel Finenzio has said. So it seems very logical that we're looking at either a cancellation or a suspension. The monitor option seems a little bit less likely to me. I mean, what would you, if you're a gambling man and I asked you to put percentages to the three options, just putting aside fine or censure, I think we're all in agreement that that's too
I think there's
little.
zero chance.
There's zero chance of that. I mean, if it's a three-horse race between cancellation, suspension, or continuation with some monitor or set of rules, oversight commission, or something like that, how would you rate the probabilities of those three options?
Remembering that we haven't yet seen the report of the Royal Commission, we don't know what else the regulator might have got from Crown as part of its continuing day-to-day review and everything else, but based on what we know in the public domain, I suspect it's about a third. 1/3 outright cancellation, 1/3 suspension for a period maybe 6 to 12 months, maybe indefinite until the manager is satisfied or the commission is the regulator is satisfied that the manager has reformed Crown sufficiently, and 1/3 Crown being allowed to continue with some conditions, whatever they might be. That last third continues to shrink in my mind, which means I've got to add numbers somewhere else. I realise that, and the reason for that is because that's the equivalent of giving Crown a second chance, and they've just had their second chance following the Bergin inquiry, so they're really on their third chance. And regulators generally work on the idea of trying to get a person's attention. You start with something lower and you increase as you go to get their attention. If the Bergin inquiry can be considered to be the second chance and trying to get Crown's attention, I think we've found out from the evidence given at the Victorian Royal Commission that Crown didn't quite get the message. So I'm not sure whether the equivalent of a second chance is the right strategy for Victoria, which is why, in my mind, I'm saying to you a third today that Crown might be allowed to continue with conditions on its license. But in my mind, I keep thinking that will probably shrink over time. And I think the suspension option might increase over time. There's a reason why I think suspension is better than cancellation, or rather the odds of suspension are higher than outright cancellation, and that's to do with the ongoing operation of the casino. It will be much easier for a manager to operate that casino which is an island surrounded by Crown's property. It'd be much easier for a manager to operate that with Crown knowing it has a chance of getting that license back. The cancellation doesn't automatically exclude Crown from getting the license. As I said earlier, they could apply. I assume there'll be some sort of licensing process undertaken by the Commission. Crown could apply for it, but once they've lost the license, I think it's logical to me to think it's harder for them to get it back than managing to keep it through some form of suspension process. Quite clearly, it's logical that it's easier if they're with a suspension. And so Crown is more likely to cooperate. The outcome is likely to be better if it's a suspension, but that relies on the manager being able to run the casino in a way that Crown recognises how it has to reform to get the license back. I don't think suspension automatically means Crown gets it back, by the way. I think suspension means that at the end of a period of suspension, the regulator might still decide to cancel the license. There might still be a view that Crown, even at the end of that 6 months or 12 months or whatever, still hasn't reformed adequately and is still not suitable. And if they're not suitable, that means no license.
I guess if there was presumably some sort of public tender like say the license was cancelled, presumably there'd be some sort of public tender process for who would take over that license. I think we're all in agreement that there would continue to be a casino in Melbourne, in Victoria, and Crown felt that they had a chance in that. Well, then maybe that might increase the chance of that one. I mean, I'm really thinking outside the box here, and I'm not a lawyer and I don't know, but could the government say, all right, we're going to compulsorily acquire all of the stuff around for the public interest or something like that? Because you really can't run a casino and integrated resort without hotels and restaurants and all the things that are around. And
so just backtracking a little bit, if you were to run some form of competitive process, what would people be getting if they bid for it? If it was an MGM or a Star or even an unknown operator, they'd be bidding for a license that is just the casino, the rest of the complex still being owned and managed by Crown, assuming Crown hasn't sold it to somebody else. It's a pretty difficult thing to conceive of who would be interested in bidding for that model. They might be interested in bidding for that if they were also able to buy out Crown's interest in the rest of the property. It's a very complex arrangement. And
actually, you could see a bit of a Mexican standoff there, couldn't you? Really, the hotels and restaurants are kind of useless without the casino, and the casino is kind of useless without the hotels and restaurants. So you could sort of like see a little bit of a war developing there.
Possibly, but we do have models where REITs own, real estate investment trusts own the properties and have to work with the casino, and the casino has to work with the property owner. So it can be done. But I don't, we're all in uncharted territory here. The legislation was drafted, I think, on the expectation that provisions of a manager would never be needed. And, if things had gone the way they ought to have gone, we wouldn't see a manager being appointed. And we still might not see a manager being appointed. We don't know what decisions are yet to be made. But, I'm leaning in my mind to the idea that a suspension with a manager is probably the neatest solution, which resolves all the issues of concern and leaves open the possibility of Crown getting its license back, but also leaves open the possibility that they don't.
Let me ask you a really blunt question. A lot of us, we've seen all the integrated resorts around Asia and around the world. We know the Galaxies and the Sands and the Winds and the Melcos. There's always been a perception in our industry that Crown's been very arrogant. Have they just, and even through this process, if you look at the council assisting's briefing or submissions to Finkelstein, he was basically saying they haven't learned. They just haven't learned. And this kind of reflects in our industry, people going, oh, Crown, such an arrogant organisation. Are they beyond reproach? Are they just a very arrogant organisation where they just can't learn? They just don't get it?
Look, I don't think they're irredeemable, but some of the individuals that are currently involved with the organisation cannot remain there for that to be the case. So look at it another way around. Let's just say, for example, that a third party buys Crown Melbourne, the owner of the license, okay? They will still probably keep 95% of the employees, because you're going to need all those dealers, you're going to need the surveillance people, you're going to need the technical staff. You're still going to need most of those people. They're just going to be retrained or culturally trained by whoever that new owner is. Crown can do that too. But Crown itself has to change at the top. The top is the problem. And that's been quite clear in the statements made in the Victorian Royal Commission, that quite clearly that the chair, Helen Coonan, and the CEO of the property, Xavier Walsh, cannot remain in the eyes of the Royal Commission. It's up to Crown to decide whether or not they want to fight to keep those people. And if they do, they're probably going to struggle to convince the regulator that they understand what reform is. If they do understand, then the chair and the CEO have to go. And it doesn't matter whether it's beyond now whether, in fact, they are, in inverted commas, good people or not. It's beyond that. Mm. And in fact, if I'm a shareholder of Crown, which I'm not, but if I'm a substantial shareholder of Crown, I'm questioning why Helen Coonan is still there. It's quite clear. It's been quite clear that she has to go. And if Crown wants to save its license, it's got to make these decisions right at the top.
Is it easier just to reform an organisation that's shown itself to be very slow to reform and not able to really change? Let's be blunt. They say they're changing. They wrote that letter as they're starting to describe themselves as old Crown and new Crown. But I don't think anybody really buys it. Is it easier? I'm just going to push this one last time. Is it easier to just say you're out and bring a new company in? Is that a quicker way to reform? I think we all acknowledge there's going to be a casino. We all acknowledge those 95% of staff, dealers that aren't those, the senior management people will stay, and it hasn't been their fault what's happened at Crown. But the people at the top who are making the decisions, our choice is either a new bunch of people at an old organisation called Crown or a new bunch of people. If you were the regulator and you had the option of making that decision, if you were Ross Kennedy and his commission, as you described them, making that decision with a recommendation from Finkelstein that their license be cancelled and a new company come in, would you make that decision?
I actually don't think that's the Commission's decision. I think it's Crown's decision. The Commission then has to approve or not approve what Crown does, and they can keep saying no, it's not suitable. But I don't think the Commission can tell Crown how it should reform, only that it needs to reform, and they'll tell them when they're satisfied.
So let me interrupt you there.
Regulation shouldn't run Crown is what I'm saying.
Sorry, Peter. Let me interrupt you there. What I mean is, if you were Ross Kennedy, and Finkelstein sent your recommendation, the Royal Commission said, "Yeah, their license should be cancelled. We believe that," and you had to make that decision. Would you do that?
Sorry, would I cancel the license if Ray?
Yeah. Would you cancel the license? Would you accept the recommendation of the Royal Commission?
If I'm the commissioner, I am not prepared to make a decision until I follow the procedural fairness steps in the legislation. That means I'll have a look at what Finkelstein has said, but I will allow Crown the natural justice step of being able to respond to it. And in fact, they still have an opportunity to respond to counsel assisting the Royal Commission on the 3rd of August. So it's not over until it's over. But if I'm a commission, and certainly if I'm Ross Kennedy right now, I am not making any statements or commitments about one way or another until I've seen the full package of information. And you haven't seen the full package of information until you've seen Crown's response. It is really, really important here that the processes outlined in the legislation are followed. And people need to understand that it will take the Commission probably a minimum of 2 months to make a decision after they've received the Finkelstein report because of those procedural fairness steps. If they're not followed, the matter's going to end up in the Supreme Court. It might anyway, but we don't want to go to the Supreme Court if it can be avoided. And if it does go to the Supreme Court, if I'm the Commission, I don't want to be the one that gets accused of having done something inappropriately, which then delays any final decision. So I'm sounding like I'm jumping on the fence or hedging my bets or whatever, but I'm trying to answer it as if I were a commissioner.
Right. So we've got...
can't have a view now, that's what I'm saying. Can't have an opinion publicly now of what it wants to do.
So just to make it clear to our viewers, so Crown still has their submission to put to the Royal Commission, as you say, on the 3rd of August, and then then Ray Finkelstein will make a decision. And let's say he made a decision, yep, I think their license should be cancelled. And then that recommendation would then go to the VCGLR, not the government, the VCGLR.
Well, it goes to the government first. The report goes to the government, who hands it on to the regulator.
But ultimately the VCGLR is the one that has to make the decision.
Yep.
And then what you would do is you would say, I've got this report that says your license should be cancelled. I see that. And then you'd go to Crown and say, what say you about this? And you'd give Crown an opportunity to make submissions in response to that report. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but I don't think a ground for disciplinary action is to say that the Royal Commission said so. I think the grounds for disciplinary action have to say the Royal Commission identified these particular reasons why you're not suitable. And so you've got to go through the report and find out what the reasons are that you're not suitable. And those reasons would be things like the credit card payments, the allegedly illegal activities, the underpayment of tax, the unsuitability of an associate, such as Helen Coonan. So if I'm Crown, thinking of what that might be, and knowing that the report by the Royal Commission is due by October the 15th, I'd want to have my house very much in order before the end of August, because you want to be in a position so that when the chairman of the Commission, Ray Finkelstein, the commissioner, is making his decisions and then writing it up, you've put in front of him reform already in place, not that reform is somewhere in the future before he makes his decision. It's got to be now. So before the end of August, I think we have to see that the chairman has gone, not that she's identified a date that she's going, or even made an announcement of an intention to leave. I think she has to be gone. And it's a bit more complicated for Xavier Walsh as the CEO of Crown, because the property needs to have someone run it. And that person, by definition, is an associate of Crown and has to be suitable by the regulator. You can't bring in somebody who hasn't yet been approved by the regulator as CEO. So for Xavier Walsh to be moved on, someone else has to take his place. That person has to be approved by the regulator. You might have somebody internally that's ready and available, and you might not. And if you don't, all you can do is say, Xavier will leave as soon as we get this new person on board, but we have identified what we're doing. So it's a little bit different for him, because you can't leave Crown without somebody running the property. and that person has to be approved by the regulator.
So when you say August, when in August? They're making their submissions on the 3rd of August. When in August should Helen Coonan go for the benefit of Crown?
Oh, in my view, she should go tomorrow, right? But that's what I think. But at the very latest, you've got to sort of guess, when do you think the commissioner will make his decision by, and when do you think he'll start writing his reasons for decision? If you think he's going to make his decision on the 17th of September, then make sure it's done by the 17th of September. But we don't know when he's going to do that. So the earlier, the better. We don't have any timeline of what happens between the 3rd of August and the 15th of October. Other than that, that's the time that he has to make up his mind by reviewing the evidence and writing his reasons for decision. The earlier they can do it, the better. 3rd of August would be a good date to announce it, I would have thought. If it hasn't already happened, that is.
Who knows? It might be happening as we speak.
Exactly.
It could easily be. And judging by the Bergin report, which was 700 pages long, I'm sure Commissioner Finkelstein will be producing a similar weighty tome documenting all of Crown's failings. So I think he's going to need a few weeks to write that up. So that comes out 15th of October. Regulator, you said at least a couple of months. So now we're talking. I think
to do so to avoid any accusation of not having followed the procedures and steps of the legislation.
So that gets us to the 15th of December. As we know, Christmas, nothing happens. So we might be talking early in the new year, some kind of decision, some kind of, Crown losing their license. If they were going to lose their license, could be January.
Yeah, I think that's realistic. 2 to 3 months, I think, is realistic. And I think that's going to be difficult for the community to understand. And it's worth probably saying it over and over to give people breathing space to understand that it's got to be done properly.
Look, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking to you, Peter. It's been a long interview, but it's been a very, very interesting. Look, one last question. You're an Australian, and so am I. I'm sure I want to talk about the Packers for a second. As we grew up, Kerry Packer was always the richest man in Australia, and his father before him, Frank Packer. The Packer name has been synonymous with wealth and with gambling and with casinos in Australia for decades and decades and decades. Arguably, one of the reasons why Crown sort of stood up to the regulator, and people tend to get stars in their eyes when the Packer name comes up in Australia. I mean, are we seeing now the real downfall of the Packer empire here? Is this the swan song? And James he's got a fair percentage of his wealth tied up in Crown Casino, doesn't he? And if that wealth effectively gets eroded, or the vultures come in, or a Blackstone or a Sands comes along and buys Crown at the bargain basement price, he hasn't got much left, has he? What do you just as an Australian, what do you comment about that?
I think it's the other way around in some respect. If these problems had not arisen, we know James was looking to sell his shares. He probably would already be out of the casino industry by now. He's, in a way, been stopped from getting out whilst this process continues. So I don't think this process actually changes the end result, which is that I anticipate James Packer will not be a shareholder of Crown, or at least not a significant shareholder, which is the term meaning he holds 10% or more. But it was clear that he was been trying to do that for some time, with approaches to win and Melco coming to him and so on. So I think it was always going to happen. I don't think this actually changes anything in that respect. It just that it might change the value that he gets as he exits.
Well, that's kind of my point. If he'd exited a few years ago, what's he got, 30, 36, 39%, whatever it is, it escapes me just right now. But he might have got $3 billion for that or whatever. He might be looking at a lot less than that now. So
still a lot more than you and I have. So I'm not too concerned.
You're not crying for you're not crying any
I'm not
years.
I mean, I met James a number of times when as regulator, and this won't surprise you. Everybody that comes and talks to the regulator is always very nice. So I've got nothing bad to say about James, because he was always very nice when he came and spoke to us.
I'm sure he was. And I don't think there's a lot of sympathy for him out in the general public, giving evidence from his super yacht to the Bergin Royal Commission. Anyway, look, Peter, it's been really, really interesting, and I'm sure we'll speak to you again as this all rolls out, probably after 3rd of August and certainly after 15th of October. Thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome, Andrew.
Great. And we'll see all of you next time on IAG Trade Talk. Bye for now.